So I look at the calendar. It tells me it's the first week of December. Today we're celebrating the first Sunday of Advent. Now, I don't know about you, but for me it doesn't feel like the first week of December. Well, yeah, it's cold outside and the leaves are gone from most of the trees and the Christmas decorations are up and the first weekend of Moravian Vespers wraps up this afternoon. But for me, something's missing. You see, it's the first week of December. I checked the seminary's website and classes end this coming Friday, so I know what's missing. Because I experienced it every December from 2009 until last December. It's something that Peter may be able to relate to. See, I'm missing crunch time. That time of the semester when I would be writing final papers and others would be studying for final exams. Now, needless to say, it's a somewhat stressful time. How am I ever going to get this done? That professor wants how many sources? When the stress level was high, I would say to myself, Mike, you did it last semester and the semester before. But that never seemed to help. The only thing that seemed to help was remembering. Remembering that indescribable feeling of satisfaction from clicking submit that last time and crossing that last assignment off the whiteboard on the wall next to my desk. So now I may describe crunch time as these last couple of weeks of the semester. The reality is that the effort to get those papers written began well before the start of crunch time. In some cases, it may have been from the very first day of class when I saw a final paper and a topic came to mind right away. And once that topic was selected, the preliminary research began, finding the relevant research materials from the books, the commentaries, the videos, and the journals, reading the material, watching the videos, taking the notes that I would then use in the writing process. And of course, the whole time I was doing this, I was mindful of the wise words of Riddick Weber, one of my professors, who said early on in my time at seminary, a good paper can be determined by how much of your research does not make it into the paper. If you used all your resources and all your sources, you probably did not do enough research. Now, I can't speak, though, for all my classmates, but for me, most of all that work I just described was finished before crunch time was beginning. And my point is this. It took 2 weeks of work or so, it took many weeks of work, rather, to be ready for the 2 or 3 week crunch time when I wrote those papers. I cannot describe the feeling of satisfaction I experienced when I clicked submit to turn in that last paper and cross that last assignment off the whiteboard. But what I can tell you is that that feeling of satisfaction would not have happened if not for the work that was done for the many weeks leading up to that moment, especially crunch time. So today we begin a new church year, and the season we call Advent. During Advent, we prepare for and anticipate the coming of Christ. We remember the longing of Jews for a Messiah and our own longing for and need for forgiveness, salvation, and a new beginning. Even as we look back and celebrate the birth of Jesus in that humble stable in Bethlehem, we look forward in anticipation of the second coming of Christ and the fulfillment of all that Jesus promised to us in that first coming. So our readings during Advent, during this time of waiting, preparation, and anticipation, reflect this tension between looking back to Jesus to celebrate Jesus' first coming and looking forward to Jesus' second coming. And this morning we heard in those words of Paul him reminding his listeners of the blessings Jesus provided while Jesus was here on earth to strengthen us as we await for Jesus' return. But then we heard a lament from the book of Isaiah. Now remember, scholars believe that the 66th chapter book of Isaiah we see in our Hebrew Bible is actually 3 different books. First Isaiah is chapters 1 to 39, written prior to the Babylonian exile. And that, scholars believe, was actually written by Isaiah. Second Isaiah takes us from chapter 40 to chapter 55, and that was written during the time of the exile. And the last 11 chapters, 56 to 66, were written after the Israelites had returned to Jerusalem from exile. So it's interesting. Our text this morning was from Isaiah 64. It's near the end of 3rd Isaiah, written after the exiles had returned to Jerusalem. And it's a lament. They're back. They should be joyful. Yet they're lamenting. What's going on? Well, if we go back a few verses into chapter 63, we find out. It seems that the people think God has abandoned them. God's turned his back on them. And then in 63:19, the author writes, "We have long been like those whom you do not rule, like those not called by your name." Wow. They're back from exile, and apparently they've turned their back on God. Well, what happened? Well, scholars tell us there are a few things going on here. When the Persians came to power, they allowed the exiles to return to Jerusalem. But remember, not all the Israelites were exiled. Some remained in Jerusalem. In addition, when the Babylonians ruled, other people from other cultures settled into Jerusalem. So now these exiles return. And this is 70 years after they were exiled. So this is probably a second or a third generation. These aren't the people who were actually exiled. And they're returning, not knowing Jerusalem other than what they were told, to people who were second, third generation of the folks who stayed. So none of these folks know each other. And in addition to that, when the Babylonians took over, chances are people from other cultures moved in and settled into Jerusalem as well. So can you hear? Now, to add to that, remember, the Persians still ruled. So the best thing for the Persians was to keep the people divided. So can you hear the comments? It's not their best that are coming back. These are the criminals. Watch it. They're coming after your jobs. If we look back at our own history, we see that in the 19th century. These types of comments were made about German immigrants coming into this country. Maybe some of the same German immigrants who were the founders of this congregation. If we look at the 20th century, the same comments were made about Irish immigrants coming into this country. Maybe even Debbie's mother and her 2 uncles and their parents who immigrated from Ireland. And if we listen to what's going on in this century, don't we hear the same comments being made about some folks coming into our country? So even though these folks were God's chosen people, they were behaving like those who God doesn't rule, like those who God did not call. God, make the earthquake. Do those awesome deeds that we don't expect. Come down and the mountains will shake at your presence. Because the last time you did that, God, you brought us the 10 Commandments, the rules that should guide our relationship with you and with each other. See, the author's looking back. The author's reflecting back on those words we heard from Exodus a few weeks ago. And then he says, there is no God like you who works for those who wait. The confession and the lament continue. And then things change. It changed with one word: yet. The word yet tells us that the author is shifting his emphasis from confession and lament to faithfulness. God, you are the artist. You are the potter. We are the clay, the work of your hands. You know, it's very interesting reading that text in the context of the rest of that reading. When I look back at how I've heard that verse in the past, I think of this pot. And I think of these hands lovingly and gently molding this clay. I'm reminded of the Carrie Landry hymn that asks God to mold us and fashion us into the image of Jesus. Isn't that what we think of when we hear this text? But that's not what's happening here. We have totally abandoned you, God, but don't forget, God, you made us. It's almost like the author is trying to lay a guilt trip on God. Then the author realizes what artisans do with work that doesn't satisfy them. Okay, Peter, how many times have you been writing a song and you couldn't get it, so you crinkled up the piece of paper and rolled it in a ball and throw it away? 100 times. And you know, I'll tell you what, that's the disadvantages of doing papers on the laptop. Just pushing the backspace key just does not have the same satisfaction as crinkling up the paper and throwing it across the room. Of course, you don't use as much paper that way either. Here he's saying, don't get too angry, God. Don't roll us up into a ball and throw us against a wall. Don't get that angry that you get new clay and start over, because we are your people. So Advent's our time of preparation. It is our time of reflection. And like every year, Advent finds us longing. Longing for peace between nations. Longing for a time when we can worship, shop, work, walk on a sidewalk, or attend a concert without having to fear for our safety. Longing for a time when God will break into our reality like God did when the Berlin Wall fell or apartheid ended in South Africa. How many of us long for an end to human trafficking and freedom for the more than 5.5 million men, women, and children ensnared in its trap? How many of us long for an end to the threat of nuclear war? How many of us long for the time when working a full-time job at minimum wage is a ticket out of poverty, not a chain binding us to poverty? And how many of us long for a time when we have access to health care because we're a child of God, not because of the name of our employer or the balance in our checking account? What is it that you long for? It's crunch time. It's a time for us to prepare for our celebration of Christmas. The time when we remember Christ's first coming and anticipate Christ's second coming. It's a time to live in that tension. And there are some that don't want us to do that. They want us to skip the reflection and the preparation and jump right to Christmas. And they suspect they want our focus to be on the past, Jesus' first coming, not on the future, Jesus' second coming. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if they're only focused on Jesus' first coming and celebrating a birthday? And that may be what the world wants. After all, the Hallmark Channel's been playing those "And They Live Happily Ever After" Christmas movies since October. That is, if they ever stopped playing them from last year. And the Christmas merchandise is in the stores for at least that long. But our text this morning is asking us to do something different. Our text this morning is asking us to reflect. It's asking us to acknowledge those times when we have turned our backs on God. It's reminding us that God will work, but we must wait. It's crunch time. But here's the thing about crunch time. If I didn't put the effort into preparing those papers, if I didn't do the research and the reading and then take the time to reflect on everything I had read, I would not have had the same indescribable feeling when I clicked submit and crossed that last assignment off the whiteboard. We all want that indescribable feeling that comes with Christmas Day. Are we willing to do the preparation that having that feeling requires? Are we ready for crunch time? Amen.